we are going to conclude with a panel on local leadership in California, and specifically to look at what he has described as the new California model for local leadership. And to do that, we've assembled just a great group of local government leaders and policy analysts. I'll begin with introductions. First, going to my far left, Will Swaim is the president of the California Policy Center. He's a journalist of over 3 decades and began covering international business in 1990. In 95, he was with the Village Voice, and LA Weekly hired him to launch OC Weekly, the first and still only alternative weekly in Orange County. He was more recently editor of watchdog.org and vice president of journalism at Watchdog's nonprofit parent, the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. To his right, Mary Barke was elected to the Orange County Board of Education in June of 2018 to represent the 2nd District. She currently serves as the board president. She spent a dozen years in the insurance industry in the private sector, then went to work for her family retail business and raising a family of her own. And finally, to my direct left, welcoming back to the stage, Mayor Faulconer, SVP's visiting professor for community leadership and government innovation, both last year and I'm excited to say this year. And again, he comes to this position after serving as mayor of San Diego for 2 terms. Please welcome back our panel. So in some ways, we're going to try to bring some threads together, but with a focus, obviously, on California leadership at the local level. And I thought maybe a place to start would be to draw off of what I thought was Greg Brooks' very interesting comment about politics at the local level, which is something that I have seen over and over again in some of the local government work around the state that I get a chance to do at Pepperdine, which is this weird kind of inverse relationship, or inversion, I should say, of what are understood to be political identities and policy identities, which is to say that in some of the most, I remember I gave a talk a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, to a group of Santa Monica homeowners, and generally an older group. And I began the talk by saying that it's great to be here in Santa Monica, one of the most conservative cities in America. And for those who may know that Santa Monica has this identity as the People's Republic, it caught some people by surprise. But if you try to stick a shovel in the ground, if you try to build something, if you try to do something that at all impacts the size of the community, the look of the community, the amenities of the community, you're going to get people acting up and out on those issues. At the same time, there are conservative parts of California that on a variety of issues, both in economic development, I would argue housing, criminal justice reform and so forth, act in ways that could be perceived as more progressive. So Will, I want to just start with you about that inversion of political identities that we see here in California, particularly at the local level.
Well, if I understand your question, that's a big if. What I guess I would start with is that the biggest problem confronting California is neither left nor right, it's government unions. That California, with 12% of the nation's population, has 25% of its government workers in unions. And that's from the state all the way down to school districts, water districts, you name it. And those unions generate about $1 billion per year in revenue, which they use in ways that are, I think, politically and in policy ways, completely at odds with what most Californians want. And I say that, I guess my evidence would be that Californians say they want They don't want to defund their police, they want to reform them, but we've got these police unions which are extraordinarily powerful in California. They are rank and file Republicans who end up, through their union dollars, funding extraordinarily progressive or left-wing kinds of candidates with whom they share nothing in common but one thing. That is, the candidate wants the endorsement of the cops, and the cops want an increase in their pay, their benefits, and greater union control over the workplace and discipline actions. So if Californians want to know, like, why can't we reform our police? What's going on here? One place to start with is the union problem.
Right.
And the public finance problems that are generated out of that, whether you're left or right, the liabilities, we've touched a little bit here on pension, underfunded, unfunded pension liabilities, unfunded healthcare retirement benefits in California, which are extraordinary. I mean, just in the hundreds of millions, close trillions of dollars. I mean, we're talking about $1.6 trillion in public debt in California, and a lot of that is driven by these unfunded liabilities. So whether, we run an organization, Mary's the executive director for local officials, and one of the things we have discovered is when Democrats come to the group, even in nonpartisan local offices. It's called California Local Elected Officials. But whether they're Democrats or Republicans, Libertarians, whatever, they're there because they say, I went in here to change things. There's no money to change anything. Like, the cupboard is bare. So whatever policy initiative I want to create, whether it's left or right, is almost dead on arrival.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, you are. I think it is worth introducing that as a theme, especially as we come to you, Mary. As someone who was born in New York, grew up on the East Coast, one of the things that surprised me so much in coming out to California, especially as someone who was at least somewhat engaged and aware politically, is I'd always thought that the Northeast was the home of unions and union influence in elections and politics. And I always thought that California was this kind of live and let live and capital P progressive government, and they were doing all these things to make government kind of transparent and efficient and so forth. But to come out here and see the power of unions, and particularly public sector unions and policymaking, was really something that took some time to sink in and has in a variety of different ways. Will mentions on the public sector side around public safety. You obviously, in your role on school board, are seeing that on the teachers union side. Talk a little bit about that. First, what your experience was in the power of teachers unions prior to getting elected, and then the process of running for office and making policy.
Yeah, so prior to getting elected, I mean, I never really had anticipated getting elected or really thought that much about the unions. I knew they didn't like school choice and things like that. And when I was running for office, people made it very clear. They said, well, what are you going to do if you want to approve a charter school and the unions will come after you? I said, let them come after me. I'm going to do what's in my heart. I know school choice is important, and that's what I'm going to vote for. I'm going to go to sleep every night knowing I did what's right. And I just got reelected by a landslide. So obviously the people are who, you have to do what's best for the people. I think you have to listen to what your public servant, you have to listen. I listened to Orange County. They want school choice. They want the protection of their children. They want the protection of parental rights. And I think if you do what they want, they go and they vote for you. They come out for you, and they don't let the union take you out. Does that make sense?
No, that's helpful. And so, Mayor, obviously you, not only were you working as a political minority, at the same time you were working against forces that were aligned with the Democratic Party, specifically public sector unions, that you also had to find a way to work with. How did you manage that?
Yeah, one of the things that I did was we really tried to break the mold of, at least when it comes to budget time. I think every mayor has to deal with this with their public sector, with their unions. I tried to separate that, because what happens is every employee group wants the same raise that you gave to that one, right? That's how it's worked for years and years and years. And how do you manage a city if everybody gets the same raise? If everybody gets the same thing, because you have different needs in different areas. And so when we decoupled that, if you will, we had a particular issue with police, law enforcement, and recruitment and retention. I mentioned that in our earlier panel. And so one of the things is I said, I have to treat what we're seeing in the attrition differently. I don't have that same attrition in some of my other unions that are facing the city. So I'm going to do what I need to do as mayor to make sure that I'm attracting the best and brightest men and women to put on the badge, to protect us, and to keep them employed. That's going to take some different resources than I'm going to have to do with some of the other employee groups that I have. That wasn't easy, but I think from a management standpoint, that's the best thing to do. And what Will was just talking about, it gives you more flexibility with the limited dollars that you do have. How can I actually do that and program that to make a difference? Now you have to go out as a mayor, and I'm glad a lot of my colleagues have talked about using the bully pulpit, because you have to go out and use the bully pulpit to sell that, and to sell why you're not just doing the same thing over and over again. But I think people get that. Again, you have to explain the principles and the values of what you're doing behind that decision. And then I think if you do that, you're going to get public acceptance and ultimately support to do that.
As we think about the lens of California politics, I wanted to bring in some survey results from the Public Policy Institute of California, which runs a regular survey called Californians and Their Government. The most recent of those was just last month in May, and the top 5 issues as listed in importance by California voters in the PPIC survey were: number 1, jobs, economy, and the inflation. That was 27%. Housing costs and availability, 12%. Homelessness, 11%. Gas and oil prices, and I probably would put in there energy prices more broadly, 7%. And water availability at 6%. Now, if we look at those as a set of issues, local government only has some limited engagement on those. But I wanted to pull out the ones where local governments do. And specifically, I wanted to look at this issue of homelessness. And Mayor, come to you, to do that through a piece, a very important piece written by Nellie Bowles in The Atlantic called "How San Francisco Became a Failed City." Yeah. It came out yesterday. And there's one quote here, and I wanted to bring it to you, Mayor, because this issue of homelessness is one that's been raised several times on a national basis, but obviously it's a major issue, as Californians have said. Quick story, 2 paragraphs here. In February 2021, at a corner in the lovely Japantown neighborhood, just a few feet from a house that would soon sell for $4.8 million, a 37-year-old homeless man named Dustin Walker died by the side of the road. His body lay there for at least 11 hours. I can't stop thinking about how long he lay there, dead, on that corner, and how normal this was in our putatively gentle city. San Franciscans are careful to use language that centers people's humanity. You don't say a homeless person, you say, quote, someone experiencing homelessness. And yet we live in a city where many of those people die on the sidewalk. Yeah. And so I think we're in an era now in California politics where we are increasingly known by what's going on in our cities. And homelessness appears to be this major issue that obviously is being experienced at the city level, and certainly in San Francisco. And the argument on one side seems to be that we are being helpful or we're big-hearted about these issues. At the same time, the message that you brought to San Diego was, by treating the homelessness in the ways that were happening prior, that were exacerbating these issues, you were actually being cruel. And you introduced normative and moral language on the other side to say situations like the one I've just described here, that was the cruel thing to do.
I strongly believe that. I mean, heartbreaking what you read about that. And we as Californians, we care about people enough not to let you die on our sidewalks. That was the whole point of what I was saying. We had to change what we were doing in San Diego. If you allow tent encampments, on our streets, on our public underpasses and overpasses, people are going to die there. You got to get them out to a clean, safe, sanitary environment, which is why we spent so much time in San Diego establishing that bridge shelter network, spending money from the city that we had never allocated before. But I realized if we didn't do it, nobody was going to come in and do it for us. There was no cavalry coming. And we needed to intervene. We needed to intervene. And we got to the spot where it was not, I want to encourage you to go to the shelter. It's like, no, we love you enough not to let you stay and die here. You have to go. You can't leave your tent in front of your house, in front of your place of business. And I'm glad that so many of my other colleagues talked about the issue that is very real, is substance abuse and mental health. And again, why we spent so much time on, it's not just enforcement, but it's bringing out our mental health experts with our homeless outreach team. And one of the great quotes from one of our folks that was in our homeless outreach team said, he said, Mr. Mayor, he said, there's a role for the cops. We don't have to be the front line, but there needs to be a bottom line. There needs to be a bottom line in our cities about what we're going to allow and what we're not going to allow. And if you do not have a bottom line, you're going to get what we see, and you're going to get that despair, you're going to get that heartbreak. I strongly believe in why we changed that whole ecosystem was I believe that every human being has a right to shelter. I believe that. I also believe, though, that as a city, that when we provide that shelter, you have an obligation to use it. And I enforce that obligation. And when we first started, Pete, I will tell you, there was a lot of folks that, oh, you can't do that. That's not, after 6 months, so many of the folks and some of my colleagues on the city council that were, opposed to taking action, were so grateful. And we said, Mr. Mayor, can you please send the homeless outreach team to my district this week? We got a real problem. But I will end with a story, and you started one. And I've talked about this. I was out cutting a ribbon at a Motel 6 that we transformed in San Diego from a motel to a single apartments for formerly homeless veterans. A gentleman walks up to me, he says, you're the mayor, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. He's coming out, he says, I just want to thank you for cleaning up the tents underneath the freeway. And I said, I appreciate that. He started, I messed up my own story. He came up and he said to me, thank you. And I said, I appreciate that because what we're doing here with this new facility is going to be beneficial. And he said, no. He said, I want to thank you for helping to clean up the tents underneath the freeway, because he looked at me and he said, I was one of the people living there. And because we intervened, because he was a veteran, he went to the veteran shelter, because we said it's not okay, and because we care about you enough, and we're going to provide that, but we're also going to insist that you use it, that young man, our Navy veteran, got his life back. He was addicted to methamphetamine. Long story short, he's clean and sober, he's getting his benefits, and he's now a peer counselor at the place that we were opening up. That's the point. And I spent, as I said, more time on this issue than I did any other issue in the last 3 years when I was mayor. And we were the only big city in California where it went down. We weren't perfect. We still had a lot of issues, but we acted. We intervened. And I think to your point, is if you see so many places, it's not acceptable, it's not okay to see what's happening on our streets and so. And if we allow ourselves to say that that's okay, it's not going to change.
But I guess I don't want to, this is a public policy conversation, but I think it has to be a political conversation. I mean, I guess one of the points I'm trying to make here is that on a few different issues, and the one we're going to explore here in a second is education, there is an inherent and tried progressive experiment going on in these policies that for really one of the first times is being found to be of a result in abject failure.
Yes, 100%.
And so what you see in homelessness, and this is the point of this Bowles piece, which keeps coming through, it's not just a set of policies that were created and it just so happens to be on the progressive side. It comes out of a progressive ethos, but which is again couched in terms of empathy and support. But as you said, if that is going to be the metric, then we're handling it in all the wrong ways. Now, I would also argue that in education, and in some ways exacerbated by COVID, that we're also beginning to see that what was framed as support for the kids, that it's all about the kids, and driven by largely a progressive political and policy infrastructure, is just flat out being shown to be false. And so I wanted to bring up for you another piece in LA Magazine, just to tee up this question for you, Mary. This was an incredible interview from August of last year in LA Magazine. If you haven't read it, you have to read this.
Yeah.
Cecily Meyer-Cruz's hostile takeover of LA's public schools. Now, Cecily Meyer-Cruz is the head of the LA Teachers Union, and we could just spend the rest of this panel just me reading this to make my point. But I wanted to pull out this one quote. Again, this was August of last year, and this was in response to the closure of public schools, and in particular, LA's closure of schools. Quote, "There's no such thing as learning loss," she responds when asked how her insistence on keeping LA schools mostly locked down over the last year and a half may have impacted the city's 600,000 kindergarten through 12th grade students. Quote, "Our kids didn't lose anything. It's okay that our babies may not have learned all their times tables. They learned resilience. They learned survival. They learned critical thinking skills. They know the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup." She even went so far as to suggest darkly that learning loss is a fake crisis marketed by shadowy purveyors of clinical and classroom assessments. Now, Mary, I think education is also one of those issues, right? That's being experienced at the local level, that has been dominated in policymaking by a progressive mindset, and also very much of a progressive political power structure through the unions. And in many ways, stories like this, interviews like this, and again, exacerbated by COVID, have, I think, opened up in the mind of many Californians the possibility that what's been going on is not really focused on the kids. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work in Orange County, generally seen for those outside of the state as a more conservative county, but still one that has these political battles going on, about since COVID, how has the policy issue of K-12 education been seen differently by either your constituents or people you're working with?
Well, I'd say with the constituents, for the first time, their eyes were really opened about the unions. They realized it was truly the unions that kept the classrooms closed, that kept kids out of school. You know, it went back and forth. It's the district's fault, it's the county's fault, it's the state's fault. But they realized it was the unions. They negotiated, you know, schools being closed. They negotiated whether kids wore masks. They negotiated whether kids would get vaccinated. I mean, it was the power of the unions that really hurt the children. And the children were hurt. For, you know, a lot of kids, school is their safest place. That's the best place for them to be every day. It's not at home. For a lot of kids, they eat at school. We at the county, we called it Reopen the Schools Forum. Actually, Will moderated that event back in June of 2020. And after listening to many experts, from psychiatrists to emergency room doctors to physicians to, we had a supervisor there, we had actually the county health director there. We determined at the end of that forum, we put out a white paper that said that we felt that kids were safer in school than not in school, but that it was up to the parents. But we thought that schools should be open, that children should all have the opportunity, that the parents should have the opportunity to send their children to school. Now, if they didn't feel comfortable, they could continue with Zoom school, but we felt it was important for children to have that option. And the union, I have to tell you, the night that, you know, the union always looks at our agenda because we are an anti-union board. We've got a 4-1 majority, really anti-union. And so the union always looks at our agenda. It's posted 72 hours was out, and I got a rumor that day that BLM would be at our meeting, and they did. They stormed the meeting. 3 people got in, and when towards the end, after the public comment, because we have an orderly way, you line up, you get a number, and you do your
Right.
public comment.
Right.
We allow unlimited. We've had over 100 speakers. I think we've had as many as 200 speakers in a given night. And that was partially because during COVID, we never had a virtual meeting. We were there every single month. We never missed a month. And we always invited the public to come speak. People would say, why do you get so many people? Well, we invite them when most of the local meetings were closed. And it got to the point where all the speakers had spoken, and one of the gentlemen who had stormed the room and was sitting in there said, well, why don't I have a comment card? And another outspoken person that often comes to the meeting says, well, buddy, you didn't wait in line. If you waited in line, you would have had a comment card. So we made a deal, if they filled out comment cards, they could speak.
Yep.
And the first one got up and he spoke, and he said, I think you guys should keep schools closed, because when schools are closed, there's no school shootings. That was the
Yep.
union's message to us, was to keep schools closed so there's no school shootings. But we passed the white paper. Unfortunately, at the county, we don't have the authority to reopen schools or do anything, but we wanted to send a message. We wanted to
Yeah.
give local district board members a tool to use. We wanted parents to have a tool. We really wanted to fight for our constituents, the people that put us in office, even though it was outside of our so-called, duties. Our duties are really as an appeals board. It's to approve charter schools. It's to approve interdistrict appeals and things of that nature. But we made a strong statement, and, the more I went on the board to approve school choice. I went on so no child was trapped by their zip code. I watched a movie called Waiting for Superman and thought,
Yep.
wow, 150,000 kids in
Important
California
movie.
are
Yep.
waiting to get into school, and then their education is determined by a lottery system. And so that was my mission. Once I got on the school board, a lot of things happened. I opened my eyes, and then we had the pandemic. And the silver lining, I think, was that everybody's eyes were open to the influence of the union.
So, Will, and speaking of comment cards, just want to put the word out there. If you have questions for this panel, please write them down. We're going to get to them. Will, the important work you're doing at the California Policy Center and around education, I think what's so important about it, to this question around the politics of California policy, is that it inherently has to be multi-partisan.
Yes.
You're working with people, parents and otherwise, that may vote at the top of the ticket very differently than they might on a school board election. And at the same time, I'm getting this sense, and I might be wrong, but I want you to bear this out, whether you sense some tectonic plates shifting on a couple of these issues, again, exacerbated by COVID, which has seemed to reveal a lot about the state of governance here in the state. But talk a little bit about what it's like to work on a policy issue like education, but to do it in a way that really does pull together these multi-partisan coalitions.
Well, one way is just for our local officials, and we work with local officials, we work with parents in a separate organization called the Parent Union, and in both situations, we really encourage people to just keep their eye on the moral imperative here, which is a child's education, and not sort of get swung. The teachers' unions in California love to say, so we're on strike to support the kids. This has been happening recently. You might have seen some of these up in Sacramento and elsewhere. And the signs always say, support our kids.
Yeah.
But the fact is that these very same teacher unions have, over the course of, 40, 50, almost 50 years now, 45 years. In the late, just to back up, Jerry Brown in his first iteration in the late 70s makes teacher unions, makes all unions, government unions in California, mandatory bargaining agents for all local government agencies. And from that moment, you can chart the trajectory of student achievement in California. We are among the very worst school systems in the United States. And given the California contempt for southern states, it's remarkable that most southern states are better than California when it comes to giving their kids an education that actually improves their performance. So I think it's really keeping, like when you hear the rhetoric that, it's important, somebody else, like the right is trying to destroy public education. We hear this all the time with charter schools. This is billionaires trying to privatize our public school system. Of course, that's complete nonsense from beginning to end. But the school choice message resonates precisely because parents really want, Mary's a classic example. Parents come to Mary specifically. I know these stories because I've helped guide some of these parents to her. Their kids are trapped in a school that is failing. And they don't understand why they're required to go there. And the answer is because this is how the unions have set it up through the law going back to the late 1970s. You go to the school that's in your neighborhood, and if you want a great humor bit on this, go look at Louis C.K. I know we're not supposed to like him, but Louis C.K.'s bit on why you go to the school just because it's near your house or your apartment is absurd. You know, we give out Pell Grants that allow you to go to a private university. What's the problem with having a young kid choose a charter school if that's what the parents want? So I think, you know, the messaging is really critical, showing what I think, if you want to look at systemic racism, look at the results for black kids, poor kids in general in California schools. They are trapped in the worst schools in our state. And they're trapped there because that's the zip code, because that's what the union wants. Our reparations committee just came out with its first study. I don't know if you got to see this, Pete, or you guys, but the study is out. It's 500 pages. I cannot claim to have read all of it. It's pretty dense. But one of the things it points out is the evidence of systemic racism in California is the segregation of our public schools. Well, who wanted that? Who demanded that black kids who live in a black community only be allowed to go to a school that has failed for generations now? I taught as a student teacher in the early 80s when I was at USC at a school that was profoundly terrible, and now it's worse. It's not gotten better. Those kids who were trapped in that school are likely sending their kids and grandkids to that very same school. So really, the problem of segregation in California schools isn't something driven by the right or by systemic racism on the right or something like that. It's driven by a Prussian model of education, driven by the teachers' unions, because that's how they get the cash to keep the schools open there and keep their teachers gainfully employed, no matter how much they fail. So I don't know if I'm making this clear, but my sense is keeping the, seize the moral high ground here. Our schools have failed our kids. And the poorer you are, the more failed your school is, and the less likely you are to get out of that cycle of poverty.
Well, I guess that's kind of one of the themes I get of this conversation I'm trying to move forward is the inversion of stated goals and reality.
Yes.
Right? So stated goals by the dominant political and policy force in the state, which happens to be the Democratic Party and the left, is that we care about the homeless, and these are the policies that are going to help the homeless. We, I think, have come to the conclusion here, not only in this panel, but others, that that is actually not what's happening. Kids and education. The stated goal is it's about the kids and what's in their best interest. I think we've come to the conclusion here, based on the dynamics of California's policy and politics, that it's not in the best interest. The next topic I want to take on, because I really do see this as a three-legged stool, is crime. Now, in my friend Michael Hendricks' great wisdom, he has timed this panel for the day after primary election day here in California, and at least one of the big stories, or maybe two of the big stories, has been the support to recall the DA of San Francisco, Chesa Boudin. And not exactly the same, but I think can be put at least in the same hemisphere of political decisions has been Rick Caruso's election moving through the top two. He was the top vote getter, but moving on to the fall as part of the top two primary result from yesterday. And the belief that LA's district attorney, who used to be San Francisco's district attorney, George Gascon, that there is a recall effort underway to recall him. Now, Mayor, you talked about some of the challenges, and again, as being in the minority political party, but also navigating a time in which, as we heard from Mayor Johnson, the support for police and maintaining a certain degree of law and order was not the majority position. At least it wasn't the loudest one. Yeah. And so talk a bit about where you see not only how you were able to respond, but what would your advice be to, say, a Rick Caruso, or leaders in San Francisco around the issue of public safety?
I always believed as mayor, if you don't have a safe city, you don't have anything. You don't have economic development. You don't have parks that people are going to want to go to. You know, people are going to go out at night. You're not going to have any of that if you don't have a safe city. So one of, I think, your fundamental jobs is to make sure your city's safe. You know, one of the, and why, again, I spent so much time on, particularly early, as we made some changes and reforms, and constantly made reforms. But who were some of the, you know, it tends to be in our African-American communities and Latino communities, some of the highest victims of crime. And so that's why you need a police department that is responsive, that is diverse, community policing, yes, it works, reform-minded, but know that there are consequences to actions. And you enforce those consequences. And so that's why I think, you know, as we saw the arc of this whole defund the police movement that is now fortunately crashing, and rightfully so, it made no sense. It just made, you know, zero common sense. And as I stood with, you know, a coalition of pastors and others that said, yes, we need the police in our neighborhood. You have to give voice to that as much as folks who, I always, you know, looked at some, you talk about that partisan lens. I think that those folks that were representing that, that aspect, defund the police, they were about maybe 5% or less of everybody in California. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, no, 95% of the people are like, come on, we need police, we need cops, we need to hold them accountable, but we need cops. But then I also think it's, as a mayor, you see the results of bad legislation. And as we look at what's happening in Sacramento, I feel so strongly that we need a competition of ideas, because you've seen, you know, the Democrats being in charge now for so very, very long. And, you know, when they put forward policies that just aren't working at the ground level, you got to be able to say, no, it's not working. You know, drug courts have basically dried up in California. There's no, you know, consequences to, you know, doing heroin and methamphetamine on the street. You see all this results of, you know, Prop 47 and 57. I can go on, probably too insider baseball. But I think the point is, to your point, these issues are issues that families care deeply about, parents care deeply about. And I think those that are successful realize you can cut through some of that, because if you're going to be a captive to some of that rhetoric, it's not going to work.
Other thoughts on the crime issue? Obviously, Mary, not directly related, but either for you or Will, thoughts?
I mean, just briefly, I would say that, you know, at a minimum, I think, you know, we've experienced, you know, school shootings, and I think at a minimum, schools should be completely fenced and gated with one point of entry. Other places to exit for safety, but I think every school should have one point of entry, and I love the idea of parking a black and white right in front. I think if some guy is thinking about shooting up a school, they see the black and white, they might just go someplace else. So I just think those as minimum requirements for school safety and to make parents feel comfortable that somebody's not coming in a back door.
One of the things I'm seeing about some of the reporting on the Boudin recall, which obviously just happened last night, but some of the reports, I think, from some of the more, from the reporters who are more friendly to Boudin, keep using this phrase criminal justice reform as if the recall, as if criminal justice reform can't happen without people like Boudin and Gascon leading this. Will, your thoughts just on this issue and politically, what you think it means for an opportunity, a window appearing to open where a multi-partisan coalition of voters and organizations are saying this pendulum has just swung too far?
Well, San Francisco is interesting. Most of the people in this room likely know that this is not the first recall in recent times in San Francisco. They just recalled 3 members of their San Francisco school board, precisely because at a time when they shut down the schools, they took up an entire agenda, a menu of a cornucopia, what are some other words, myriad new policies that were designed to make life better for the disenfranchised.
Taking the name of Abraham Lincoln off the high school.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that was
the
one.
number one goal.
Painting over murals that had George Washington in them because that was offensive to somebody. Shutting down the merit-based high school in San Francisco, Lowell, which is not shutting it down, but eliminating merit-based applications. And it was particularly that issue in San Francisco, and I'll get back to your point here. It was particularly that issue of shutting down merit-based, you know, keeping your schools closed and then shutting down the merit-based applications to Lowell that energized the Asian American community in San Francisco. And you suddenly saw activism from people who had not really had a strong presence in San Francisco politics, that gross caricature, but nothing like what we saw here. I think it was like in the polling out of the San Francisco School Board recalls showed that something like 90% of Asian Americans in San Francisco who voted for the recall. More than 90%. Numbers are very high for every other ethnic group, including black people who were just outraged by what was going on in their school system. So I think, I sometimes hear people say, well, I'd love to support your work, Will, at California Policy Center, perhaps yours, Pete, or your candidacy or yours. Would love to do it, but until California just absolutely burns to the ground, and there's, nothing's going to happen. I hate to say it, but there's a kind of a point to be made with San Francisco. That city, for those of you who've had the fortune and misfortune of walking through it lately, it's a mess. It's appalling. Recently declared, I think, by no less than I think it was the World Health Organization, one of the 5 filthiest cities in the world. That's saying a lot. I've been to some pretty filthy cities around the world, not just because I was there were they filthy. But my point is that I think, these issues, somebody else said it on one of your earlier panels, that safe neighborhoods and good schools are not a partisan issue. I think, and it's incumbent on those of us who consider ourselves constitutional conservatives, libertarians, people who are interested in the free market, to make the case that our real concern is with minority populations or the disenfranchised. I used to be on the left. That's something Pete, and Mary's heard too often. And the reason I moved to the right was because everything I had endorsed as a commie I'm not using that term hyperbolically, turned out not to be true. It did not work. Yeah. And so my own best ideas were hurting people. So my goal now is to go back and maybe make amends for some of the terrible stuff I did. But it is incumbent on us to work with all comers. The purity tests on the left are damaging the left, and they are clearly damaging the right as well. In our organization, we work with Democratic officials, as I said, parents I had a mother who works in our parent union tell me, Will, I'm your worst nightmare. I'm a feminist, progressive lesbian. And I said, I don't have any idea why you would think that I would find that problematic. You and I are both standing out here holding up signs saying, reopen our schools. Like, what? Yeah. It's not about I am in the live and let live kind of California thing. I can't remember who just said that. Short-term memory loss. But, California used to have this vibe of, kind of let your freak flag fly, but you don't have to impose that on other people. I'm not required to endorse that, but I do want our schools to work for people whose politics I might find wrong in some other areas.
Yeah, I think one of the phrases I uttered sometimes as we were going through the shutdowns was that when we're making Florida look cool, we know
it's a problem.
The pendulum has swung too far.
Yes.
Last question. The California what's the analyst's office for the state of California in looking at population demographic patterns for the state of California between 2007 and 2017. That 10-year period found that the number one age demographic leaving the state were Californians under the age of 18.
Yeah.
Now, that didn't mean we were having a rash of runaways. It meant that these were multiple kids and families were leaving. I came across this data point in preparing for this. San Francisco has the fewest children per capita of any American city. Now, I wonder, California, and I say this as someone who did not grow up here, but always used to look longingly at the Rose Bowl and TV shows from the middle of New Jersey. It always seemed to be this middle-class paradise. And I think one of the things that we're running into now is a clash of visions, which is to say that the reality that we're still breathing the fumes of California being this place where the middle class can live and thrive and feel safe and go to good schools and those kinds of things. But the reality is something utterly different. And I wonder first, Mayor, from your standpoint, we'll just go straight down the line. Can California be a home for the middle class? And what would be the kinds of issues, maybe the ones we've talked on today, that we really should be focused on?
Well, the answer is yes. And look, we all live here because we love this state, and spending the time we are because we know it needs some pretty dramatic changes because it is going the wrong direction, period. For the first time in California history, we lost population, right? We lost a congressional seat. Because why? People are voting with their feet. They're leaving.
They're going to Dallas.
They're leaving. Look at the Mr. Mayor over there. He's taking them all. I want him to be successful. I love him. But if we tie all this up in a bow of all the topics that we've been talking about today, they matter to people, right?
Yep.
And so it's going back to governance and solutions and not just the rhetoric. Man, because that has consequences. So if you don't have a safe city, people are going to leave. If you don't have jobs and economic opportunity, we talked a lot about housing, and yet we hear people stomp their feet up in Sacramento, but they won't make the changes to actually allow us to construct housing on the local level so my kids can afford to stay here if they want to. I think about what the cost of a house is. How are you supposed to afford that coming out of college, right? I don't care what college you're coming out of. So to answer your point, yeah, it can be. We always were that. But boy, that time is now, Pete. And what happens when people continue to say, I can't make it here, right? They are going to leave.
Yeah.
And we've seen what happens to cities when that happens, right? Yeah. That happens with a state. If we don't have a tax base, we don't have a manufacturing base, we don't have that. And so that's why you can't just sit back, and I see some of our friends in Sacramento, oh, that's okay, we're California. I mean, I see that all the time. But no, man, you cannot take our success in our state for granted. You have to constantly be out there working. So the answer is yes, we can be, but we ought to make sure that we're addressing those things. And again, back to results. If homelessness is skyrocketing, people aren't going to live in San Francisco or San Diego or Los Angeles because they're not going to feel safe. Crime, all of this matters. And so, and these are not, I repeat, are not partisan issues.
Right.
They are common sense issues. Democrats don't like stepping over needles and feces just as much as Republicans don't, right? And so when we talk about our kids and education, that's why I think that pendulum is swinging back. It has to swing back. And I'm an eternal optimist. I wouldn't have done the job that I was doing and things if I didn't believe that. And I think more and more Californians are, for the first time, going out saying, hey, I care about, I never was active before, because they know it's not working.
Mary, especially on education, is there hope?
Yeah, I think that to keep young families here, they're going to need access to a great education, a free education. I think we need school choice. We need more charter schools. The Epoch Times interviewed me, and why are so many families leaving LA? Why are students leaving? I said, oh my gosh, the list is huge. I mean, I know some families left LA and left the state. Some just left LA and came to Orange County because our schools were more open than LA. So I think unless children have great access to a good education, I think young families will not stay, and whether they leave Orange County or our city or they actually leave the state. So that's why I think it's really important for whether it's a school choice initiative or just more charter schools. We need more charter-friendly school boards to do that, to keep young families here.
Well,
yeah, I think really simply, I think a lot of people have talked about what we can do locally better as, and when I say we, I mean local constituents of local officials. I think one of the things that local officials can do much, much better is work together with like-minded other officials across the state. We've got a state assembly, state senate, and all statewide offices occupied by Democrats at present, with a supermajority in the legislature passing ridiculous regulation. Will O'Neill did a great job earlier describing the myriad agencies, the gauntlet he has to run through to get an approval for a housing that the government says he has to build.
right.
So one way around that is for local officials to, and I think, we had people say, you got to stay in your lane, got it. But your lane is also making sure that Sacramento is reined in. If we can't do it through some kind of election reform or whatever else to change Sacramento, use your local authority to work with other officials. We do this through Clio. I'm sure there are other ways of doing this, but in Clio, we encourage people to think, the old lefty sentiment, think globally, act locally. You can improve lives locally by working with other local officials to end the madness. And some of the madness, I mean, you guys, we've talked about some of these issues, but we have some of the greatest capacity for oil and natural gas in the world. And we just saw the ridiculousness of Joe Biden, and no offense to people who love him, but the ridiculousness of that policy when he's trying to tell the Europeans to stop taking Russian oil and then running to Venezuela to say, please pump more. And California, meanwhile, is doing everything it can to shut down existing oil, existing nuclear, to make energy more costly here with the immediate impact on the poor, the long-term impact on America's stability,
Right.
and the stability of the democracy. We ought to be in California the arsenal of democracy for America. Yeah. Instead, we are the state that is driving the rest of the country toward really insane ideas. And if we had 5 more hours, we could talk about that.
Well, I don't know if we have 5 more hours, but I know we have a few more hours at the reception, which
right.
I look forward to continuing the conversation. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.